In this hour, we are digging deeper and in real time, asking our experts about Black Lives Matter and Defund the Police. These were two major movements that were catapulted into the national spotlight, particularly after the murder of George Floyd in May of 2020. Some folks are asking, is the 10-year anniversary of Black Lives Matter the beginning of the end? And folks are wondering, whatever happened with the Defund the Police movement and the efforts to reform police departments? Again, that effort was front and center for the last couple of years. And here to help us understand what's going on with both movements is Chauntyll Allen. She's co-founder of Black Lives Matter in the Twin Cities, and she's a member of the St. Paul, Minnesota School Board and Director of Criminal Justice Policy and Activism for Wayfinder Foundation. Also joining us is Joanna Schwartz. She's a professor of law at UCLA Law School. She is also the recipient of UCLA's highest teaching honor, which she received in 2015, and the author of a new book on police reform called Shielded: How the Police Became Untouchable. Thank you so much, Chauntyll, and thank you, Professor Schwartz, for joining me. I want to start with you, Chauntyll. I read a passage from the column that was written by an LA Times columnist by the name of Erica Smith. She, I believe, was out attending one of the celebrations that happened over the weekend by the local Black Lives Matter chapter. And she asked the question, what's the status of Black Lives Matter in light of some of the financial issues that have come up, some of the controversies, the lawsuits, and then the normalizing of racism by far-right Republicans. What's your response to Erica Smith's, or this columnist's, question about, is this the beginning of the end for Black Lives Matter?
I mean, Black Lives Matter was a statement that resonated with a lot of Black people across America. It went beyond just the organization itself. And this is just a moment in the long history of struggle for Black people to find liberation. Whether you say, Black Lives Matter as that particular moment is the end, that's not going to stop the struggle. And so until Black folks have liberation, there's never really going to be an end. It's always going to be just evolving. And that's how I see it happening right now, with the movement of gathering the grassroots organizations on the ground and restructuring the organization so that we can, continue to move on. It's just an evolution.
And what about you, Professor Schwartz? You've been involved in activist movements. Obviously, much of your work as a civil rights lawyer, I read, was focused on police reform. And I know the whole Defund the Police movement became a part of the national conversation as Black Lives Matter. That movement also was gaining more prominence. What do you think about the evolution of the movement and its relationship to the Defund the Police movement?
Well, I think both the sort of rise of Black Lives Matter and Defund, although they're part of our, over the past couple of years, a decade for Black Lives Matter been in the public consciousness, these are issues, as Chauntyll was saying, that have been extremely important and issues that people have been fighting for, Black Americans, particularly at the forefront of these fights for decades and decades and decades. And we've also seen for decades and decades and decades efforts to push down these fights for justice. I mean, part of what I talk about in my book is that the fight against civil rights and the fight against efforts to secure Black Americans' entitlement to the protections of the Constitution is a fight that's been happening obviously since before the Civil War, but immediately after the Civil War as well, and ever since. And there have been highs and lows in that fight, and movements forward, steps forward, and then steps back. This is exactly what we're seeing today. And yes, there is a lot of opposition in the Republican Party, in state and local legislatures that have fought some of these issues and fight these efforts at reform and shrinking the footprint of police. But I don't see any indication that this is the end of the fight. I mean, this is a path that has been traveled over and over again, and resistance to these fights for justice don't end the fight. It just continues the fight moving on.
Yeah, and Chauntyll, how active was your Black Lives Matter chapter in the Twin Cities in terms of pushing for police reform? And did that push involve advocating for some efforts to defund the police department there in Minneapolis?
Yeah, I mean, there was an effort where the Abolish the Police got onto the Minneapolis ballot. It didn't pass. I do see it necessary to strive towards abolition, but I also recognize that there's not a lot of answers for our Jeffrey Dahmers and those type of folks that are, extreme murderers. And so until we get to that point, which honestly, the police budget is huge. And so like in St. Paul, where I reside on the other side of the river from Minneapolis, we're at about 11% defunded, and it's going to take time for those programs to really produce the positive impact on community that are necessary. We've got some other things that are happening that are on the back end or the front end of helping communities stabilize themselves. And when that happens, there'll be less need for the police officers. As that need continues to grow, there's more resources that can go back into community to continue to build stronger communities. And so here in the Twin Cities, I see us still striving forward,
And so, Professor Schwartz, the whole defund the police, it got really maligned in the media. I think it was Congressman Clyburn. They called it sloganism. And even Democratic leaders such as Clyburn and others walked away from it. What's your sense about what the movement was trying to accomplish and perhaps mistakes that were made in the way either that it was rolled out or the way that it was talked about or the way that it was labeled?
Well, I don't want to criticize, the efforts behind defund, which to my understanding, is the goal, the ultimate goal of defund is to have a society and a community where police would be unnecessary, in the future, not tomorrow. But the idea underlying defund, I think, is is to reinvest in the community in sort of front end efforts, improvements to education, improvements to housing, improvements to social welfare, and make those changes such that, police end up becoming unnecessary. And,
when I've seen a lot of polling, particularly amongst African Americans, that says that Black people overwhelmingly want the police. So that's why I'm a little confused. And I've always struggled with the defund the movement because it always seemed like when I would talk to everyday people and I would interview everyday people and look at the polling around it, there was the leadership of some of these movements pushing for that. But the folk that live in communities that are oftentimes crime-ridden, et cetera, were never, ever in favor of less policing. They wanted constitutional policing. They wanted policing that respected the human rights and the constitutional rights of individuals in their communities. But they were never, ever in favor of abolishing the police. How do we reconcile the efforts of what may be the leadership with the polling of Black folks in particular in, neighborhoods across this country?
So I think part of the issue may be about, defund sounds like taking away. And if there is a messaging problem, in my view, the focus, if you sort of get past that slogan, is about investing funds, but investing funds in other ways. And to take one example, people, there is a lot of criticism of the language of defund the police. But if you talk to people about the idea of having trained mental health professionals respond when people are in mental health crisis instead of police? It's hard. I mean, I don't know what the figures are, but it's hard, to my view, to disagree with that idea that having trained mental health professionals involved as the responders when someone's in mental health crisis is an idea that people can get behind. Now, that's consistent with the idea of defund. It's moving resources toward mental health professionals, but perhaps it's framed in that way. It's a way that people could more get behind that idea.
Yeah, I think for many people, it became a binary choice, right? Mm-hmm. So it's either or. Either we have mental health professionals or we have the police. And I would agree with you that most people probably would want mental health professionals when there's a mental health profession, when there's a mental health crisis. That's not a dangerous crisis. But I think to Chauntyl's point earlier about the Jeffrey Dahmers of the world, if there is a crazed and very, dangerous person, is it appropriate to talk about a social worker or a psychologist having to respond to a call and be expected to confront someone that maybe has a AR-15 rifle? I mean, I guess, Chauntyll, when I think about defunding or even moving resources, we have such a, we have an epidemic of guns in this country. We're such a violent country, unfortunately. And I think that's what a lot of Black folks are responding to when they say they want police.
Yeah, and I think we should really look at a lot of the resources that are not attached to actual police officers. When we think about the amount of money that goes into, what I call popsicle pitchers, the amount of money that they put into police departments to engage with community, and the amount of money that they put in there for militarized trainings and the tear gas and the rubber bullet, all of the things that are unnecessary to use against regular civilians, that amount of money is a lot. We ain't even touched the police officers yet. So let's take those dollars.
And do you believe, though, let me ask you this, do you believe many of those programs where that money is being directed are effective?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I mean, we have to look at, who really needs to engage in our community. When we talk about young people, we need youth workers, not police officers. And so why is there such a small amount of money in those pots, but such a huge amount of money in these other pots, when we know for a fact that the engagement with young people in providing resources and opportunities to find success prevents criminalization? You know what I'm saying? And so we have to put the money in the pots that work. We have to put it into the housing. We have to put it into the mental health services so that our communities are stabilized. And with that, there's way less, the police officers will have time to actually solve some crimes.
Right. I know we focus on those violent
piles of crimes that are unsolved in our police department. So what is the money really being used on other than harassing Black people in the community?
Yeah, one of the things we see, Professor Schwartz, is always the power of the police union. So whenever there are efforts to move money from the police budget to some of those social service budgets, we see the union, rise up. And even after, I'll say, the height of the defund movement, when you saw certain cities move dollars to social service organizations or their social services departments, slowly but surely, a lot of that money was moved right back into the big fat police budgets because of the power of the police unions and because of the power of law enforcement in our country. So how do we, give more power to people and less power to those unions that have been able to not only dominate city budgets, but also, as you write about in your book, maintain systems that prevent accountability?
Yeah, I mean, the power of the police unions are really remarkable. One interesting thing about this idea of not defund in those terms, but about getting police out of the job of responding to people in mental health crisis, homeless issues, people, with nonviolent car accidents. In LA, in Los Angeles, the police union supports getting out of the business of doing those things. And the union officials have said, basically, we're not psychologists. We're not mental health professionals. We're not social workers. let us not do that stuff and focus on the crime fighting. So there actually might be a place where everyone could agree.
Wait a minute, Professor. They say that, but have they been willing to relinquish parts of their budget? Because we know under Mayor Garcetti in Los Angeles, there was some percentage of that budget that was moved out of the police, and then it was moved right back to the police. So they say they're not psychologists. They don't want to be in the business of mental health, but are they willing to put their money where their mouths are? We're talking about the status of the Defund the Police movement and its relationship to Black Lives Matter, that movement, which some are questioning where it goes from here in light of the recent backlash we've seen from Republicans and what some call the normalizing of racism in this country. So, Professor Schwartz, we were talking about LA, and you said that the police department has welcomed the idea that mental health professionals will provide mental health support and get police out of the business of mental health. But I was just looking back at what happened in LA after George Floyd's murder in May of 2020. And the then mayor vowed, it was like June of that year, to cut the budget of the police by $150 million, faced an immediate backlash by the police union. And then for the 22-23 budget, there was a 6.5% increase to the LA Police Department's budget. And currently their budget is 26% of LA's overall budget. So police say they want to get out of mental health business, but are they willing to relinquish any of that big fat budget?
Well, I'm not, we don't talk all that much. So I'm not exactly sure. My guess is no, but I also think sort of hearkening back to part of the conversation we were having earlier in the hour, these struggles, these efforts at reform take multiple steps. I don't think that there's going to be a transformation of the way in which the city or county of Los Angeles provides its mental health services, in an instant. I think the fact that the police union has an interest in getting out of the business of doing mental health work, mental health response and other kinds of responses where there's not a need for someone with a gun or someone with arrest power is going to be the first step. And then it's going to take a lot of work to build up the infrastructure and capacity to have community organizations and other non-police personnel to respond to these events. And then there's going to be extra money that's going to have to go toward those other services. And then eventually there's going to be conversation about how many police we need and what they're doing. If you look at other parts of the country, there have been these kinds of responders. In Eugene, Oregon, there's been a mental health response unit that doesn't involve the police for over 30 years. And the way it happened, it starts as a pilot program, then it gets bigger, then it gets bigger, then there's more money used to fund this. And in Eugene, they estimate that they're saving over $20 million a year by having this response. It means that people aren't having to go to emergency rooms and aren't being arrested that otherwise would be if the police were involved. So I don't think the long answer to your question, I don't think the police are going to be applauding reducing their budget. And my guess is that LA is not going to try to reduce their budget anytime soon. But let's see how this process works and start getting people in place, a core in place to try to provide these services that we really don't need the police to do. Study it, see how it works, see how effective it is, see what kind of money it saves, see how calls are reduced perhaps to police. And then there might be a reason, a justification to try to rethink the budget.
We see, Chauntyll, particularly, it was Minneapolis, right, where the feds just came out with the scathing report about the Minneapolis Police Department and basically forced the department into a consent decree, which is an agreement with the Department of Justice to make systemic changes to that department. That just happened, I think, about 6 weeks ago. I remember that big press conference. What has been happening in terms of the implementation of some of those mandates, I won't even call them recommendations, mandates by the Department of Justice, and how are community leaders like yourself feeling about the Minneapolis Police Department's efforts to implement those changes?
I mean, everything is always slow. Everything always moves slow, and they're not anxious to try to relinquish any kind of power that they have. I do know that they are trying to end all low-level stops and the petty stuff, but they're not really, it's a slow ball moving, right? They're like, yeah, okay, this happened, so now what do? We've got to form a committee, and then that committee has to meet, and then they got to meet about when they're going to meet again. You know what I'm saying?
They have to study it. Then they have to write a report.
Exactly.
They got to write about the report. Yeah.
Exactly.
It's
so, I don't see much really happening on the ground, where I'm at, moving around, any different than what I saw, 2-3 years ago after George Floyd was murdered. And so I still get reports of people being harassed. I still hear about, we haven't had any murders in the last couple months, but, I mean, it's still happening. Police are police. And I think that's why the young people were really focused on abolishing it, because there is no real reform that's going to liberate us from slave catchers. And we have to be very clear about that. We have to be very clear of who they are and what they stand for. And the fact that we still have slavery language in our Constitution, in our federal Constitution, and in our state Constitution, the police department are always going to just police, right? And I think the next move is to really get to the root of things, which is eliminating some of that language, some of the slave language out of the 13th Amendment statewide, until we can get the feds to get on top of it and call a constitutional convention to eliminate it that way. But we have to keep pushing forward.
Well, we have a UCLA award-winning law professor, so let's talk about that language. We happen to have the perfect person to respond to that language that is still embedded in our, constitutional amendments. What do we do about that, Professor Schwartz?
Well, we certainly could have a constitutional convention and work to change the language. I think that language is powerful, and it's important to recognize that the 13th Amendment continues to allow for involuntary servitude, for slavery, as a punishment for a crime. And as has been, so powerfully illustrated in 13th, the way in which our current criminal justice system operates, it exposes disproportionately Black Americans, Indigenous, Latino Americans to the to criminal sanctions, and then is this loophole? I think the question about how we move forward and whether it's focusing on that amendment or on other work at the more local level is sort of an open question. I mean, I think there's more than enough to be done at every step of the way. And I guess my thoughts are always to keep the most ambitious visions in mind, and also to be working incrementally day to day to try to make the current world life better than it is.
We were talking about ways to move reform efforts forward. Ask Chauntyll, who is the co-founder of Black Lives Matter in the Twin Cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul, about the consent decree involving the Minneapolis Police Department. What are your overall thoughts about the effectiveness of federal consent decrees? We know they weren't used under Donald Trump's administration. The Merrick Garland administration has been much more aggressive under their civil rights department of going into police departments, doing these exhaustive investigations, writing these very comprehensive documents mandating systemic change. Depending on who you listen to, the results of these consent decrees has been mixed.
So I should say in Minneapolis right now, there's been this initial report, but they haven't yet negotiated the consent decree. So the first thing that happens is that the DOJ goes in, spends a lot of time talking to people, reviewing documents, and writing this exhaustive report that outlines all of the problems. Then they have to negotiate what the exact terms are of what the city's going to do. And then they hire or appoint a monitor who can go in, reports back to the court about whether those changes are happening. I think my general view is that the process is slow, the process is expensive, and the process does seem to work, at least to some degree. Now, work doesn't mean that things are fixed. It might mean that pretextual stops go down. It may mean that uses of force go down. I don't think that these are total fixes, but I think that they are improvements. I also think it's worth noting that what the Department of Justice asks for in its consent decrees have changed a bit over time. So if you look at the Minneapolis report, we don't have the consent decree yet. Part of what they talk about is the same things that have often been talked about: improvements to use of force training and internal investigations and hiring, supervision, things like that. They're also talking about the fact that Minneapolis has a mental health response team that doesn't involve police. And part of the recommendation by DOJ is that program get more money, get more funding, get more people. And so that is something that has been mentioned in I think in Louisville and some other consent decrees. But this is kind of a new set of demands that the Department of Justice is making. And I'm really optimistic about that additional approach to the DOJ's consent decrees, not just training and supervision, but also this same question that we've been talking about. Let's ask what the police should be doing and what's better done by other trained people.
Yeah, I think one of the issues, you can't talk about police reform without talking about the issue of implicit bias, without talking about the image or the way that police interact with Black suspects or individuals, Black people in general, when they confront them on the street or whether they're in their homes or a public place. And there's this notion that, many police see Black people, particularly Black men, as inherently dangerous, and that when they encounter a Black male, they react differently. And the reason we have the brutality, the murders, the shootings, the killings of Black men, in particular by police, is the way that Black men are thought about in this country, and the way that many white and even police officers of color, because it's not just always white on Black, it's oftentimes police of color. How do we get to that? Because that's something that's very difficult. We can't legislate hearts and minds. We can't, change that in a consent decree. But in the work that you've done, Professor Schwartz, what is the most effective way to deal with this perception around Black men, particularly, as dangerous?
Look, I mean, this is a problem not just with policing, right? This is a problem with America and the implicit bias and racism that is not just limited to the police force. I think that there have been studies and research about trying to measure whether implicit bias training works, to what extent that it works. And there's certainly efforts to try to do that training, to try to improve in that training. My own sense is, and I've have said a version of this before, but is thinking about limiting the kind of authority that police have to do these stops. There's a lot of research that has been done that shows that when officers or anybody is forced to make a split-second rapid decision, they make mistakes. Not only do they make mistakes, implicit biases and biases become even more pronounced. So when we have officers doing traffic stops, for example, stopping someone on a highway, for example, for a taillight, and the officer has been trained in his training that he's likely to get hurt or shot or assaulted, even though that's not actually true if you look at the data of how often those kinds of things happen during traffic stops. But you have an officer stressed, thinking that they're in danger, coming up, and see a Black man in the car, and all of the implicit biases that are already there are even more powerful. So why are we, you can try to improve that officer's response, but also let's pull back the lens. Let's think about why this stop is happening in the first place. Let's think about, do we actually need to have that interaction at all?
So you're saying do what we can in terms of implicit bias, but let's change the number of encounters that police have with civilians, pedestrians, motorists, and that by changing the number of encounters, we, by definition, will reduce the number of the opportunities for them to use force, excessive force against individuals. What do you think about that, Chauntyll?
I mean, I agree. I just, St. Paul just ended all pretextual stops. And, I travel a lot, wasn't paying attention to my tabs. And I got a letter in the mail from the police department that they noticed that my tabs were expired and I should go get them redone. And I thought that was a great way to inform me rather than hitting the cherries, making that sound that, instantly sends anxiety through all Black bodies. And then, having to have that interaction at all. And so I just went and got my tabs and now we're good. And I didn't get no extra ticket. I didn't have to interact with a police officer who might have been fearful because I looked masculine, and something bad could have happened. So I think that, that's the direction we need to be going. They need to be more help than harm. And that's ways that they can do that.
And are you finding, Professor Schwartz, are police departments around the country looking at ways, other than at the mental health issue, that they can reduce the number of encounters? Because it sounds like, there are lots of ways that we as civilians can think of that police won't engage with the public. But what are police thinking, are departments thinking about pulling back from some of those encounters? Because again, if they have less encounters, they need less people. And if they need less people, they need less budget. So it all goes back to money.
Yeah. So the two areas that I've seen the most movement on are response to mental health, people in mental health crisis, and these low-level traffic stops. And efforts to get police out of the business of traffic stops is underway in Philadelphia. It was being considered in Minneapolis. I'm not sure whether that's true as well as in St. Paul, in LA, in Los Angeles, in Berkeley. These are ideas that are happening around the country. As far as the police and the police budgets go, you're also hearing that police can't recruit enough officers and are having challenges recruiting officers. So in some ways, I want to say, look, problem solved. Like, let's take some of your responsibility and divert it to other groups that can fill those responsibilities, and you don't have to worry about traffic stops anymore. But of course, I say that, but of course, when it comes down to dollars and cents, there's going to be fights. There's going to be challenges about this, and the unions often win. But we'll see. We'll see once there's more responsibility that's being given to other groups other than the police. Those budget conversations might look different.
Yeah, we didn't get to talk about it, and we're running out of time, but I definitely want to talk about the reform movement that we saw that impacted prosecutors, because prosecutors also play a big role in what happens with police departments, because, our prosecutors prosecuting those low-level offenses. We saw in Illinois today the elimination of cash bail. That's another part of the reform effort that has been taking place all over this country. So lots is happening for sure. And for those folks that think the defund the police movement may be dead, the phrase may not be used as often, but there are activists like Chauntyll and others who are still doing the work of trying to make our police departments around this country and our criminal justice system in general more equitable, more fair, and remove the implicit bias, as well as the excessive force and the disproportionate negative treatment of African Americans. So thank you so much, Chauntyll, for your work. Thank you, Professor Schwartz. Your book, Shielded: How the Police Became Untouchable. It's a new book just out this year. Make sure you pick up a copy of it. Appreciate the work that you do on this issue. So valuable to have a law professor, civil rights attorney like yourself engaged in this work.